My brother sold our father's farm on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, there was a real estate sign hammered into soil. My grandfather cleared by hand in 1958. Nobody in that conversation checked one thing: whose name was actually on the recorded deed. Before I go any further, if someone in your life has ever assumed something was theirs without checking, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. My name is Daniel Marsh, and for 22 years, I've made a living reading boundaries other people assumed were already settled. I still picture him at that same kitchen table, the county map spread flat under both hands, tracing property lines with his finger like he was reading a story only he could see. I'm a licensed land surveyor, 48 years old, and not the kind who spends a career staking out suburban lot lines for developers who want a fence moved 6 inches to the left. I'm the kind clients call when two neighbors have been arguing for 30 years over where one property actually ends and the other begins, when an old iron pin has rusted down to nothing and nobody alive remembers exactly where their grandfather drove it into the ground. I go back to the original survey every single time. The recorded plat, the meets and bounds description, the bearing and distance nobody has bothered to reread in 60 years, because a feeling about a boundary and the actual boundary are almost never the same thing, and somebody has to be willing to say that out loud, even to their own family. My father, Earl Marsh, farmed 340 acres of corn and soybeans in Millbrook, land his own father cleared in the spring of 1958 with a borrowed tractor and a debt he spent 11 years paying off one harvest at a time. I grew up on that farm, driving a combine before I was legally allowed to drive a car on a public road, memorizing the smell of diesel and turn soil the way other kids memorize a favorite song, but I was never going to be the one who stayed. I left for engineering school at 18, got my surveying license at 26, and built a business 40 minutes away that now employs 6 people and does, most years, better than the farm ever did. My older brother Gary stayed. He's 52 now, and he has worked that same 340 acres every single season since he was 19 years old. Through 3 separate droughts, through years the soybean price dropped so low it wasn't worth the diesel to run the harvester, through a marriage to a woman named Melissa that didn't survive the debt those years created, and through raising 2 kids largely alone once she left. I have never once pretended Gary's life was the easier one. Staying is its own kind of hard, and I know he believes, down in his bones, that the staying itself is what should have earned him that farm outright someday. No discussion necessary. No name but his on any piece of paper. Just last spring, I spent 6 weeks untangling a property line dispute between 2 dairy farms 2 counties over. The kind of case where both families were certain, in good faith, of a fence row that had physically drifted 9 feet over 4 decades of nobody checking. And I still remember standing between 2 grown men who'd known each other since grade school, watching them go quiet when I finally showed them the original 1962 survey. That's the job. Somebody has to be willing to hand over the paper that settles it, even when everybody involved would rather keep believing the version they've told themselves for years. For most of our lives, if I'm honest with you, I might have agreed with Gary anyway. 11 years ago, in the spring of 2015, 3 consecutive years of drought had put my father 4 payments behind on the farm's operating loan, and the letter that arrived from the bank used the word foreclosure, without a single softening word around it. Gary was 39 that year, in the middle of his own divorce, in no financial position to co-sign anything with a bank that was already asking hard questions. I was 37. Established with a credit history and a business balance sheet the underwriter actually wanted attached to that loan before he'd approve a single dollar of the refinance. My father asked me to meet him at the bank in Millbrook on a Thursday morning, and I remember exactly what the loan officer, a man named Coombs, told us both, because I've repeated it to myself more times than I can count since. A personal guarantee with no ownership interest in the collateral doesn't satisfy this underwriting, not for an amount this size. Not after 3 years of missed payments already on file. If I was going to guarantee 340 acres, the bank needed my name on the deed itself, not just my signature on a promise sitting beside my father's. My father didn't hesitate more than a few seconds. He signed a deed that same week, adding me as joint owner alongside him, recorded at the county recorder's office on April the 9th, document number 2015-04117, filing fee $38, paid in cash from an envelope he kept in the truck's glove box. Benny asked me not to tell your brother, holding both my hands across that same kitchen table the way he used to when I was small enough to still need steadying during a thunderstorm. Not because I don't trust him, Danny. Because if he ever finds out this farm came one bad season from gone, he'll spend whatever pride he has left trying to prove it never needed saving, instead of just running it the way he already does better than either of us. I kept that promise for 11 years. I paid my share of that loan quietly, in transfers Gary never saw on any account he had access to, roughly $1,100 a month for most of a decade. And I told myself the day would come when the balance hit zero, and the whole thing would simply fade into a piece of paper nobody ever needed to look at again. My father died on a Sunday afternoon in November 4 months ago, in the same recliner he'd fallen asleep in most nights for 30 years, of a heart that simply stopped somewhere between the evening news and dinner. He was 74. He'd farmed that land for 51 years, missing exactly 2 planting seasons in his entire life, both times for surgery he scheduled around harvest instead of around his own comfort. Gary found him at 7 that evening and called me at 6:40, and I drove the 40 minutes from my office in what felt like 11, running 2 stop signs I've run 1,000 times sober and law-abiding. The funeral was the following Saturday, at the Lutheran Church on County Road 12 and 60. Some people came despite a sleet storm that made the back roads nearly undrivable that morning. I gave the eulogy. I talked about a man who could tell you the exact acreage of any field in 3 counties just by looking at it, who never once in 51 years let a fence line drift an inch without correcting it that same season, who kept a hand-drawn map of every field soil type folded in his truck's visor until the day he died. I didn't mention the deed. I didn't mention the promise I'd made him. 2 days after the funeral, standing in the machine shed sorting through a lifetime of tools neither of us had touched in years, I heard Gary on the phone with Melissa, his ex-wife, in a corner of the shed he clearly thought was private, in a voice that had already moved past grief into something else entirely. "Whole thing's mine now," he said. "Finally get to do something with it instead of just surviving on it for 33 years like Dad did." I said nothing. I stood very still behind a stack of feed bags until he finished the call. I told myself grief makes people say strange things in the first raw days, things they don't fully mean. And for about a week and a half afterward, I actually let myself believe that. I even called Gary 2 days later, half expecting him to say something that would let me keep believing it. And instead, he asked, almost casually, whether I still had my old copy of Dad's will somewhere, since he couldn't find the one Dad kept in the house. I told him I'd look. I didn't tell him mine was 17 years out of date, and that a much newer document, one he didn't know existed, was sitting in a fireproof box in my own office, 40 minutes away. The for sale sign went up 11 days after the funeral, planted at the end of our father's own driveway by a commercial real estate outfit, out of the county seat, the kind that lists farmland for agricultural investment groups, rather than families looking for a home. I heard about it from Hollis, our neighbor on the adjoining 80 acres, not from Gary. When I called my brother that same afternoon, he answered like he'd been expecting the call for 11 days and had already rehearsed every line of the answer. "Dad's will leaves the farm to me, Danny. You know that. You got out at 18 and never looked back. And I'm not going to sit on 340 acres out of some guilt I don't actually feel, not when I've got an offer for $2,100,000 sitting on the table from a company that says it can close in 30 days. When I asked him to slow down, to at least let me look at the paperwork before anything got signed in either direction, he said the sentence I now hear every single time I close my eyes at night. "You'll thank me later, Danny. This isn't your life anymore. It's mine. And I'm finally getting to live it instead of just working it for you and Dad both. For free. For 33 years running." He wasn't wrong that I'd left at 18. He wasn't wrong that he'd carried 33 years of a life I chose, deliberately, not to live myself. But the will Gary kept quoting from memory had been drafted in 1998, 17 years before that Thursday morning at the bank, and it left the farm to, quote, "my sons in equal parts," with no mention anywhere of a deed quietly rewritten and recorded a decade later. Gary had never once in 11 years driven the 15 minutes to the courthouse to check whether that old will still matched what the county actually had on file. Standing in my own driveway with the phone still warm against my ear, I understood, uncomfortably, that neither had I stopped to correct him. Not yet, anyway. I drove to the county recorder's office myself on a Tuesday morning, the same building I've walked into for other people's property disputes several hundred times across 22 years, and pulled the deed the way I would for any paying client who wanted certainty instead of a family's word for it. Document number 2015-04117, recorded April 9, 2015, indexed in book 442, page 19. Grantor, Earl Marsh. Grantees, Earl Marsh and Daniel Marsh, as tenants in common, each holding an undivided 50% interest. Notarized by a clerk named Whitcomb, who since retired, stamped, filed, sitting exactly where it had sat undisturbed for 11 years, completely unaffected by whatever 17-year-old will Gary believed had somehow covered the whole property. Tenants in common means something very specific, something I've explained to other people's families for a living more times than I can count. Each owner's own share passes through their own estate when they die. It doesn't jump automatically to whoever's left standing. My father's 50% went through probate under his 1998 will, the one that left everything to, quote, "my sons in equal parts," exactly the way he'd always intended it to. Split evenly between two sons, that's 25% apiece. My own 50%, the half added in 2015, had never belonged to my father to leave to anybody in the first place. Gary hadn't just skipped a signature. He'd walked toward a $2 million closing, believing he owned the whole 340 acres outright, when the only will he'd ever read had only ever touched half of it, and even that half left him holding 25%, not 100. I sat in my truck in that parking lot afterward and read the document 4 separate times, the exact way I read a disputed boundary survey, before I'll ever put my professional stamp on it, because a feeling about ownership and the actual recorded chain of title have never once, in 22 years of this work, turned out to be the same thing. I thought, sitting there, about every client I'd ever handed this exact kind of news to across a folding table in some field, watching 30 years of certainty rearrange itself in real time behind their eyes, and I remember thinking, almost distantly, that I'd never once imagined I'd be the one on the other side of that folder. I didn't call Gary that same day, or the next. 22 years of resolving property disputes teaches you that the worst possible move, with a discrepancy this size sitting on the table, is to confront someone before you know exactly how far they've already gone down the road they've chosen. I let it play out for 16 days. I told myself I was simply gathering information, the same patient, unhurried approach I'd use on any survey where two neighbors are both absolutely certain of a boundary that cannot possibly be true for both of them at once. What I did not know yet, and wouldn't know for another 11 of those 16 days, was that Gary hadn't just listed the farm with a sign in the yard. He'd already signed a purchase agreement with the Agricultural Investment Group, accepted an earnest money deposit of $60,000 into an account, and scheduled a closing at the title company in the county seat for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning. Hollis mentioned to me, almost in passing over a fence post one evening, that he'd seen a survey crew out walking Gary's fence rows the week before. A company I didn't recognize, confirming acreage and boundaries for a closing that was already fully scheduled, for a sale that legally could not complete without a signature that had never once in 11 years belonged to Gary alone to give. I spent most of those 16 days doing the same thing I do for every other client before I ever say a word out loud to them. I called my own attorney, a woman named Angela Cho, I've used for business matters for a decade, and had her confirm, in writing, exactly what a joint tenancy with right of survivorship does and does not allow one owner to do without the other's signature. She confirmed it in 4 sentences over the phone that I made her repeat twice, and I hung up knowing precisely how this was going to end, before Gary had any idea it wouldn't end the way he'd already told $60,000 worth of strangers it would. I walked into that title company on Thursday morning at 9:40, 20 minutes before closing, with 3 documents in a folder: the recorded deed, a certified copy pulled from the county that same week, and a letter from my attorney confirming that any conveyance of that property required the signatures of both owners of record. Gary was already seated at the table with the buyer's attorney and a title officer named Renata, going line by line over a settlement statement for $2,100,000. He looked up at me the way you look at someone who has clearly wandered into the wrong meeting entirely, in the wrong building. I set the folder down in front of him without saying a single word, the same way I'd set a disputed survey down in front of a client who spent 30 years insisting a fence line was somewhere it has legally never once been. He opened it, he read the recording date, then read it again. I watched him do the math the way you do when a number refuses to fit a version of events you've been repeating out loud to yourself and everyone else for 16 straight days, and I watched the exact moment it simply stopped fitting anything. "This isn't right," he said, his voice thinner than I'd ever once heard it in 52 years. Dad would have told me. I gave him the one sentence I'd promised our father, at that same kitchen table, I would never say while he was still alive to hear it. "He didn't tell you because he knew exactly what you'd do the moment you found out this farm was ever one season from gone, Gary, and you're proving him right about that in this room, right now, in front of these people." Gary didn't apologize. He didn't argue the deed itself, because there was nothing left in it to argue. He looked at me the way you look at an auditor, who found the one line you were quietly hoping nobody would ever bother to check, and he said the sentence I know I'll remember for the rest of my life. "You always did think 2 years of engineering school made you better than someone who actually stayed and did the work." I said nothing back. There was nothing left to survey between us. A recorded deed isn't an opinion, and it isn't a grudge left over from when you were 26 years old. The closing didn't happen that day, or on any day after it. I still drive out to that farm most Saturdays the way I have since I was a boy, though I let a neighboring family lease the fields now, because I never learned to actually farm, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise at 48 years old just to make a point. I haven't spoken to Gary in 4 months. He didn't come to Thanksgiving. He didn't come the week I finally walked out to the old northeast corner of the property, the one my grandfather set with an iron pin in 1958, rusted down to almost nothing after 67 years in that soil, and drove a brand new survey monument into that exact same spot myself, by hand, the way I've done for hundreds of other families over 22 years who needed a boundary nobody could reasonably argue with anymore. There's no clean ending here. Nobody shook hands over that fence line. He walked out of that title company 4 months ago, and hasn't called once since, and the last thing he ever said to me wasn't a goodbye. It was an accusation, and I've made my peace with that being how it ends, at least for now. 22 years in this profession taught me one thing that never once changes. A boundary isn't what somebody remembers, or what somebody feels they've earned by staying the longest season after season. It's a recorded bearing in distance, sitting quietly in a courthouse, waiting for somebody patient enough to go and actually read it, before they say a single word out loud to anyone. If someone in your own family is telling you what they believe they're owed, go find the actual document first, before you believe them or argue with them, either one. It's almost always sitting exactly where the county left it. Has your own family ever assumed something was settled that never actually was, on paper where it counted? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. If this one stayed with you the way it stayed with me, hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and share it with somebody who still needs to hear that the recorded line always wins in the end.